ahead into what we plan, we ask that you would quiet us down and remind us of a truth that is so beautiful and full that we cannot adequately comprehend it or name it. And so suffice it to say that we are grateful for your claim on our lives, for who you are, for your promises, for your grace, for your mercy. And we ask that you would help guide us as we try imperfectly to be sure, but try to faithfully navigate these lives you've given us as a gift. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen. So one of the things I'm finding about teaching on sermons that I've already preached is that it's a little humbling, because I realize, like in today's another example, there's a whole like dimension of the sermon I preached in September that I didn't adequately communicate in the sermon, but I can now because I've got a month of reflection on it. So when I talk about, this is what I did not make clear, I don't think, in the sermon that I preached from the pulpit, but the provision I'm talking about in this scripture and in that sermon and in today's class, the provision is leadership, the leadership that God provides for God's people. And I want to say too that in the Reformed tradition, the Presbyterian Church is a part of the Reformed tradition. One of the things that this is somewhat unique or distinctive, maybe not unique, but distinctive. In the Reformed tradition, we believe, Calvin wrote about this, that the highest calling any of us can have is not to be a minister. It is to be a civil magistrate. Calvin believed that the call to governance, to leadership in the public sphere, is the most important calling any of us can have. And so I say that, now there are lots of people, lots of leaders in the civil magistrate who fall woefully short of that calling. But the point is that we believe that governance, I'm not talking about parties, I'm talking about the idea of there being an ordered government, that is not just a human endeavor, but that is actually a gift of God. So, you know, we joke about Presbyterians doing things decently and in order. We've made that quip all the time. We think that like governance is the way that God helps us, that God it is a gift that God provides so that we can live out our lives with some structure and some order and some law. So I don't know if you guys knew that, but when we talk about government, and it's not just, there are lots of different kinds of governance, and there's been lots of different models of governance throughout history. We're going to talk about biblical governance today, but the idea of governance is in our tradition one of the ways that God provides for us. So any comment on that or question about that, or is that news, or is that old news?
It's like news I've heard before, but I just want to be clear about the civil magistrate. You're not the highest calling as far as the offering toward the church, but in the marketplace and the.
I think what Calvin meant by that is that, you know, if you think about everything, the church, not everything is the church. There's a world beyond the church. And so the reason that the civil magistrate is the highest calling is because it provides leadership for everybody, not just the church, but beyond the church. I think that was part of what his thinking was. Yeah.
And this doesn't really connect, but I mean, I think Presbyterians have always taken that so seriously in our governance that, is it not true that the US government was kind of organized in our, not to join church and state, but as a model?
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things that makes Presbyterian is our governance. It's the way we organize ourselves. That's right. And we take it, if you've ever been an elder or deacon and read the book of order, we take it really seriously. Yeah. Okay. What else? Did I hear a question? No. So, just a reminder, these have been up the past 2 weeks. One of my hopes for the sermons and for the class and for our church is that we can claim, in spite of our differences in political opinion and partisan opinion and different ways we're all gonna vote on Tuesday or have already voted, that is a part of our lives. But as people of faith who belong to the community in Christ here at First Presbyterian Church, that's not all of our lives. So we believe that there's something even more true about whatever our political convictions are. Which is not to say that, again, I said this the past 2 weeks, that does not mean that we ignore the political process and the realities of the world because we're in some spiritual sphere. Like there's not a separation of those things. It doesn't mean we can't talk and debate about our differences of opinion. It doesn't require that we agree. I know that we don't agree on many things. But what it does mean is that what matters more than any of that is our identity as God's people. That, and I'll say that in as plain a way as I can say it. At the end of the day, we're not partisan. We are, we're God's. And I don't mean we are God's, you know what I mean? Appropriate. There we go. We're God's people. Yeah, did you hear the pastor said that we're God's? That's right. And I think I'm pushing y'all again to, it's easy to say that. It's harder to live that. And so in the midst of any kind, and here, this is where that shows up, in the midst of any kind of discussion you have in this class, on email, on social media, with whomever else in the church, you may get into it. You may debate. You may, you may raise your voice because you're passionate about something. But what's more important about that, and this is not to say that differences don't matter. This is to say that what matters more than those differences is the fact that we belong in a covenant community and that we're claimed by God and Jesus Christ. That's the whole ball of wax. And to really think about that and believe that and model that, even when you have disagreements with your fellow church members, that is hard and it's worth it. That's what I'm saying. Okay. All right. Tuesday's coming. Take a deep breath. That's right. I have gotten so many text messages in the last week. Oh my gosh. Did y'all see Saturday Night Live last night?
Yeah.
It was this great skit, and this is not taking sides. Kamala Harris was on Saturday Night Live, and who was she played by?
Maya
Rudolph. And there's this funny scene where Maya Rudolph was like texting, and her husband Doug said, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "I'm texting everyone in America." And Doug is like, can you take me off the list? And she's like, absolutely not. So I mean, like, in a battleground state, we're getting all the visits, and Tim Walz was at the Marriott on Wednesday. It was a weekday school event, and next to the playground was like a SWAT team and the Secret Service and an army of motorcycle, and so anyway, such is life in North Carolina in 2024. But we're gonna have an election. Somebody's gonna win. We probably won't know who for a little while. And the world's gonna go on.
Yeah.
And next Sunday, we're gonna gather here. And that's still gonna be true. So, right? So let's take a deep breath. Okay. what I want to talk about today, again, is leadership and God's gift of providing us leadership. And, and some of the, and one of the things we can learn today, as we look back on ancient Israel's evolution of who led them. So we're gonna spend most of this morning talking about, I'm not connecting a lot of dots. We're gonna talk about the way ancient Israel was led. And there, you'll see when we get into it, there was a kind of a debate between God and God's people about how they were gonna be led. And I think that there's something we can learn from that debate. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. That's Moses. Okay, I want to take you through just real quickly, some history, with a little bit of tongue in cheek and, you know, it'll be casual, but, God's people were, when they forged their own identity, they were first led by Moses. And you remember Moses, who, was called by God, in the encounter with the burning bush. And then Moses, and he didn't want to lead. You know, I tell people, like, nobody that God asks to lead says yes initially. They don't want to do it. They feel inadequate. And so that's instructive for the rest of us. Moses helped, as he was trying to, affect the Israelites' freedom, out of Egypt. He led through the plagues. He led the people, when Pharaoh let them go, and then tried to get a take back and follow them into the Red Sea. He led the Red Sea crossing. He led through 40 years in the wilderness. He led, the people when they received the law from God. There comes a point in Moses' leadership, and I do this in officer training, where Moses acknowledges how hard leadership is, and it is increasingly complicated because, you know, the journey of 1 year turns into 20 and 30, and the people are complaining because that's what people do. And there are hard decisions to be made. And do you know what Moses says to God? Anybody? Kill me now, I can't do it anymore. That's what he says. And God says, okay. And so God takes part of the mantle of leadership off of Moses' shoulders and commissions elders. And that's where we get elders in the church. Okay. But for a while, Moses is the leader. He is the one who led them out of Egypt. Until they get to the promised land. And when God's people got to the promised land, you remember Moses famously looks over into it, but he never makes it there. He dies before they go there. The promised land, inconveniently for the Israelites, is occupied. We don't preach a lot about that, you know, but if you want to read the book of Joshua, who is the next leader, I don't do a lot of children's sermons on Joshua, because it's a little complicated with, you know, invading and conquering and, yeah. But a different kind of leader is required for this part of Israel's life. So Joshua is a commander, and he led the people into the land that was already occupied so they could establish it as their own. No commentary, please, on my choice of pictures. I'm terrible at choosing pictures. That's probably not what Joshua looked like, but anyway. So we have Moses, we have Joshua, and then, once the people of Israel are into the land, and years go by, and they begin to settle into the land, and they begin to grow. And there begins to be a need for a little more sophistication about the ways that they're governed. You can imagine, right? You're just walking through the wilderness for 40 years, that's one thing, but establishing yourself as a nation, that's a lot different. The model of leadership that God provides is our judges. So you guys probably know in the Old Testament, it's a book called Judges, and there are judges who are in charge of kind of different precincts and in different seasons of life. You've heard of some of them. Deborah, Gideon, Samson. Samson was really strong. That's probably not what Samson looked like either, but you know, yeah, I mean, I talk about feeling an addict, but I don't, that guy's. So the judges provide leadership for a long season of Israel's life, while the nation grows. Here's the other thing I want to name about this part of Israel's history. They all this, instead of being a people in captivity in Egypt, instead of being wandering people for 40 years, 2 generations on the way to the promised land, they're now establishing themselves as a nation. Some of the reality of that is that when you, they are a nation amidst other nations. They see things, they're exposed to things, they bump into other cultures, they bump into different models of leadership. It is harder to maintain your identity as a distinct people when you are exposed to different experiences. That's not an argument for not being exposed to different experiences. I think about our kids. I want my kids to be exposed to different kinds of people and different kinds of lifestyles and countries and a consequence of that is that it is probably always harder to maintain your identity. And sometimes your identity can shift in ways that are helpful. Other times you can lose your identity because you get subsumed in a larger culture. So that's just one of the realities. When you become a nation, you begin to compete with and compare yourselves to other nations, right? I mean, gosh, this happens all the time. Yeah, I mean, this country's got a larger GDP than we do, and their trade is more than ours, and their president or king has been, why can't we have a president or a king like that? I mean, that's just that is human nature to do, and countries do that with one another. The third reality is the wealthier you become, the less you remember what it means to be dependent on God's provision. One of the things that always happens, who's been on a mission trip before? All right, every mission trip I've ever been on, whether I was a youth or in college or as a pastor, what always gets said when you go on mission trips?
Come home from it. There's
When you're
a,
there, what do people say?
they're great. People there have nothing and they're very great.
Always. That's right. The people there are happy and they're grateful they don't have much. I think the subtext of that is that when we bump into people who are less affluent, less wealthy than we are, we see that it's easier for them to recognize God and God's hand in providing for their life. Ergo, when we get back to our more comfortable lives, that have more things that we can, money and gadgets and help, those things insulate us. They can become a distraction so that we forget that we too are dependent upon God. Because we believe, I think with wealth, I'm including myself in this, with wealth, we believe we become in control of our own lives, right? That happens to countries. If you think about Israel, in the wilderness, it was really obvious that they were dependent on God. They had to get water from a rock. They had to get manna from heaven. When they go into the promised land and begin to flourish as a nation, it's less obvious, okay? So that's all that went on through Israel. And, I forgot a Bible again, Gerald. We have a Bible. Oh, here we go. All right. I'm guessing you've not, this is not in like vacation Bible school curriculum. 1 Samuel 12. And I'm gonna read it because it's one of these passages that when I was a kid in Sunday school and the teacher would say, can you read this passage? It has a bunch of names in it. My hand would start to sweat and my voice would quiver. So I'm not gonna do that to you guys. But I want you to listen, and I'm gonna read this and I'm gonna ask you if you can figure out, what is going on here. Oh, sorry, it's 1 Samuel. It's not 2 Samuel, which was very strange for me to read right now. 1 Samuel 12. Samuel, by the way, is a judge, okay? So this is Samuel 12, 6 through 17. And Samuel is speaking. Samuel has a relationship with God and he's speaking to the people, to the Israelites. All right, Samuel said to the people, the Lord is witness, who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your ancestors up out of the land of Egypt. Now therefore take your stand so that I may enter into judgment with you before the Lord, and I will declare to you all the saving deeds of the Lord that he performed for you and your ancestors. When Jacob went into Egypt and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your ancestors cried to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron and brought forth your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of King Jabin of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And then they cried to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we've forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Asterites. That may not be right, but go with me. But now rescue us out of the hand of our enemies, and we will serve you. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Barak and Jephthah and Samson and rescued you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you lived in safety. But when you saw that King Nahash of the Ammonites came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, though the Lord your God was your king. Okay, somebody say back to me what you heard in that.
We want a king.
Yeah,
I agree, we need a king.
we need a king. So that kind of traced Moses, didn't mention Joshua, but it's implied, and then the judges. And at the end of the day, the Israelite people say, we want a king. We look around the countries that have dominated us, and we want what they've got. We want a king. It didn't go well. So this is the other part of the story. God, and this is one example. There are others, and I want to say too. You guys have probably heard the name Walter Brueggemann. Every pastor quotes Walter Brueggemann. I was lucky to have him as an Old Testament professor at Columbia Seminary. He's one of the most famous Old Testament professors in the world, actually, and he's spoken here a few times, been a Willard lecturer. What I'm going to say is because I took classes from Walter Brueggemann. There is in the Bible, there are parts of the Old Testament, and you probably, the ones that are most obvious are probably the Psalms that celebrate the king. A lot of times it's King David. There are other parts of the Old Testament, this is an example of one of them, that are kind of, Brueggemann calls it kind of anti-monarch. There's a narrative in the Old Testament that is very clearly arguing against kingship. Both things are in the Bible. So if you're thinking like, but I've read, Psalm 23 about King David sounds very favorable. That's true. There are other parts of the Bible that argue against the monarchy, and this is one of them. So Brueggemann's argument is that in that example where Samuel is talking to the people, God is saying, you don't, trust me, you don't want a king. And the people are saying, no, we want a king. And God is like, well, you know, there's a lot of issues with king. And in the end, God gives the people a king. You recognize the first three names? There's King Saul. He wasn't great. There's King David. Lots of great things about David. Not all of it's great. You may remember Bathsheba and sending Uriah to the front lines of battle. Solomon builds the temple. Solomon's got a big ego. That's the thing about kings. They usually have big egos. And then all the other names you see below there. So there's the United Kingdom, so there's one Israel, and then there's Judah and Israel. And so then the kingdom splits. And that's the lineage of Israel and Judah's kings. I don't know if you guys recognize, what's some names you might recognize in there? Ahab, Jeroboam, Hezekiah, Josiah, he was a pretty good one. You know, I would put the over under on percentage of good kings at like 10%. Most of these kings, what do you think most of these kings do?
Fight.
Yep,
Enrich themselves.
enrich themselves, what?
That enrich themselves.
Cede sovereignty to other nations because they're trying to enrich themselves. They're corrupt. Let's see if I could. With judges, the goal of that model is governance. It is order. It is mediating disputes. It is providing for people. It's less ego. It's less celebrity. It's spread out. For a king, ostensibly, all those things still happen, provision, governance, but what God knows is that with kings also, it becomes, when there's a king, it's usually about the king. It's less about the people. And that's what God was afraid of, and that's what happened. So, I've already showed my next slide.
Less about God.
It's less about God. What God could have done is told you, but that's not what God did. And this is, oh my goodness. By the way, I got two more texts about the election since we started today. One of the things that I want to say is that in that tension between what the people want and what God knows, what we should also recognize is that that helps us understand and hopefully appreciate the fact that the God who made this world and created us and provides for us is not a tyrant, that God is in relationship, and that there is give and take, right? I mean, what God could have said, no, you don't get a king. You get what I give you, you know, you get what you get, you don't pitch a fit. That's what I used to say to my toddlers. That's not what happened. The relationship between God and God's people is dynamic. It is a relationship. There is give and take. There is promise. This is what I teach confirmation class. God makes a promise, people break the promise. God makes the promise again, the people break the promise. God makes the promise again. I mean, that's what faithfulness looks like from God's standpoint. There is provision, and then when we say we don't like that, God tries again to provide something else. I don't think re-provision is a real word, but I used it. So there's provision and re-provision. But one of the things that I think we can learn from Israel's evolution in what kind of leadership they wanted is that, what they discovered when they got what they wanted in a king, is that, the king cannot deliver the people. That no one who becomes king can provide for our every need. And that no one whom was chosen to lead can know us like the one who knit us together in our mother's wombs. People want kings to do that. I will say, like, did y'all see the Netflix series, The Queen? God, it's so good. One of the things I learned from that, and the reason I thought that was so well done, is it gave me an empathy for the Queen and for what it is to have everybody in the empire, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people in the empire project what they think you can do on you and then bear the weight of those expectations. So I mean, it's not that I think monarchs throughout time are soulless people. I can't imagine the pressure of having all of those expectations placed on a person. Well, I mean, inevitably, when that happens, the person crumbles because they're not God. So, all right, before I try to connect the dots a little bit more, I think you can look back. I won't go to this year's election, but I'll look back. Have you seen there are these pictures of like when a president comes into office and when they leave office? It's unbelievable. I mean, the impact, the body keeps the score, the impact that leading as a president has on a person's physical body is remarkable.
Yeah, they put him about 10 or more years older.
They do, at least that. And I think, of course, we are a democracy. We broke away from England. We tried to make George Washington a king in essence, and he thankfully didn't want it. He walked away. The great Hamilton song about that. But I think functionally, as we get bigger as a country and there's more and more money in our politics, if you were an outsider coming in and people said the president's not a king, they'd be like, really? They live in a huge house. They have all this power. Like I think we have over invested and projected a lot of our own expectations and needs on the person that we elect as a president. And they may want that and may not want that. It may be fair, it may not be fair, but they carry those expectations. And so, and I think a lot of times what makes elections and partisan conversations about presidents so hard is that whatever party we're from, we invest these things in the person that we vote for. I think sometimes we have an expectation that whoever we elect president is going to provide for all of our needs. That they're gonna know us, that they can deliver. Like we have put too much on the shoulders of the people that we elect as our leaders.
Amen.
And I think that the scripture gives us a warning that doesn't work, that is not, if governance becomes celebrity rather than about, providing like order and mediation and helping for the common good. Think judges versus kingship. If it becomes about a figurehead and a celebrity and power and wealth, then we are on really shaky ground. So, now I'll turn it over to Gerald.
And I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I would say thank you, Ben, because you're heading out the door. Texted Penn yesterday or last week and said it takes a lot of courage to tackle this topic. And so we appreciate the willingness to give us space to process, which is, I think, one of the good things that's happened. Want to give you all a chance to look at Penn's questions here and then have the kinds of conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks. I'll just start with the first one. Do we expect more from our president than we used to? And why?
24-hour news cycle is one thing.
Okay. Sarah said that the 24 hours news cycle is one thing, and what does that do?
Depending on how they use it. We see more or less of what they're doing.
Okay. Yeah, so we maybe see a little bit of a skewed picture of what's actually going on, or what potentially what the news source chooses for us to see. Tom?
Politicians promise an awful lot more than they used to.
So thinking back about Penn's last slide, why do you think that is the case? Why did they promise more than they used to?
They want votes.
Small service is coming. That's right.
Oh, Ryan.
I would piggyback off of the last comment to add that because the campaigns are now funded more by corporations and special interest groups than by actual citizens, that would create a higher demand on what our presidents are and other elected officials are expected to accomplish, because they're not only having to match public opinion, they're having to satisfy the needs of their donors at the corporate level and the special interest group level.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I would also say, going back to Penn's last slide, that, sorry, I can't change the slide now that I've done Zoom business on there. But the last slide where he says, we've set up huge expectations for our leaders. And maybe that's why I'm thinking why they promise more, because they know that they're trying to meet our needs.
It's way easier to register a complaint about what you don't like now than it was 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
Did you all hear what Roger said? It's way easier to wait to enter a complaint than it used to be. And it goes back, I think, to kind of what Sarah is saying. We've got all these options, these outlets to register a complaint.
I haven't been around as long as some of you in the room, and I'm not being facetious, but it's just like a change in era for a lot of, who can be in the White House at this point. It's not like, traditional gateway like it was sometimes past. So that's a big new territory that we all gonna have to explore.
Yeah.
I think part of it may be that we've relinquished some of our personal responsibility to someone else.
So say more about that.
I just think that it's easier for us to say, let the elected officials handle it. I won't get us involved. And therefore, the expectation is that they'll do that.
That's a good observation. Rich?
I have a couple reactions to this. Well, one is maybe I don't necessarily agree that we expect more in the sense that over many years, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a great historian, but there's been a lot of important presidents and a lot of good things accomplished, and a lot of bad things done. And there's always been expectations, I think, of the president of what they're going to accomplish. So the question is, what's really different now? And certainly media has ramped up. The very first comment is ramped up to to levels people couldn't fathom and, 50 years ago. And definitely 100 years ago, but, so I think that might encourage more of the celebrity style. He was talking about celebrity versus what you're gonna do. What are you gonna do versus how can you entertain? And I think it may shift the balance to more of the celebrity of our presidents, whoever they are, whatever party.
For sure, it goes both sides.
Well, also the fact they promise certain things and then they turn around and don't fulfill the promises all the time.
Well, and that might go to the comment that presidents promise more than they used
Right,
to, and
right.
they promise more than they're able to do.
Uh-huh.
So Chris,
One of the things that's different recently is the use of the executive order. Presidents get in to the presidency and they do things by fiat that used to be done by the legislature. Some of those things don't hold up, but that is a reality that's relatively new.
Well, the legislature is deadlocked. I mean, that's a lot of accomplishments.
right? I would say to Rich's comment too, that we've had good presidents, bad presidents over the year, that someone very astutely pointed out. We have been in different places and different times where we've had deadlocked legislatures, and we're in a new phase of that, to Cynthia's point. That doesn't help anything. But it's thinking about kind of what we're talking about with the presidents and expectations and promises is this question, are we expecting more? And, you make a good point. Maybe we're not expecting more than we used to. But I like, David, the direction that you were going, which is maybe we are willing to, we're less willing to do something on our end. But we still want the same outcome. So we put that on someone else. So, yes.
Yeah, one of the things too, that as far as like expectations that we do that several other countries don't, is we have the head of government and the head of state as the same person, right? Whereas in the United Kingdom, they have the Queen and the Prime Minister. So all so Penn was talking about all the weight that the Queen feels about, all these expectations and being the symbol, right? And then the Prime Minister is doing the work, of running the government. Whereas here, we've actually kind of invested both that symbolic quality and the actual running things into the same person, which probably leads to heightened expectations as well.
So just feel free to speak up on any of these questions, or on the same one. The second one, what does having a strong leader save us from?
Division
Say that again, Catherine.
from being divided.
Oh, okay, strong leader can save us from being divided. That's assuming that strong leader builds unity.
Well, that's true.
And that is certainly the intention, I'm
I'm
sure.
assuming that the strong leader would want a united country.
Tom, I saw your hand up.
By strong, do you mean effective? That's question.
And I'm leaving it to the group. How strong do you mean effective? And how would you differentiate between the two?
And there could be strong leaders who aren't good leaders.
True, exactly.
Do you have another thought on that, Tom? Or are you just asking?
Well, I think on the juxtaposition of good governor versus, clever celebrity, there's a pretty big gap. And, I think we're a lot of us, society at large is pretty short-term focused, and social media, lots of trends support that. I just think that we're drifting too far towards a celebrity model. And that what we really need is I think what most people believe is a more moderate, more effective governor instead of a more clever celebrity is what we're missing. And that's what I was trying to suggest. So that's why I was asking the question about what do you really mean by that? I think we're in need of we're in terrible need in my mind for more effective leadership. But we're having a really hard time recruiting those people because of the tribalism and the media cycle and all the challenges of being part of that system.
So, Ian, I think you had your hand up, and then Chris.
I was just gonna say, my favorite president is Lincoln, there's no way he would get elected.
Can't hear what you said.
Ian said her favorite president is Lincoln, and there's no way he would get elected today.
Yeah.
Chris?
I want to agree with Tom, but I want to point out that the electorate needs to respond to the cult of personality.
And Rich?
Oh, again, in the reaction to the strong leader, I think strong leaders, when I hear that, I think of military. And, well, it saves us from, invasion, okay, so that's a strong leader, but I think the idea there is, according to this lesson, he was saying is the strong leader is not necessarily what you want, because there are strong leaders out there in North Korea and other places that, I don't know, we want that.
Maybe South Korea, but not North Korea.
So maybe strong leader isn't the savior we would.
Well, yeah, that's, the strong man idea is a dictator, that kind of thing. But I think being able to be a communicator is what we look for in our president.
And I would go back to what Catherine was implying of a unity, a unifier. So, yes.
I was just going to feedback on the communicator. I think the strong leader, an effective leader, generates that understanding. And I think as things get more complex in our world, a lot of folks are looking for just to understand what's going on.
To make sense, that's a word the key that I'm looking for, it's the way to make sense. Excuse me, Ed in the back.
What happened, the third question is beyond the president or elected officials where it's got to provide for the well-being. And in our American system, we believe in inalienable rights, like liberty, pursuit of happiness, and limited government. And that we give internally of office, we have checks and balances. But our rights come from God, that those are inherent to us. And while we might have a leader with years, you're saying that where does God provide? God provides basic human rights to us.
Thank you.
Regardless.
Yeah. Yeah. Alice.
I wonder if the reason we expect more from our presidents we used to, there's so many more attempted assassinations of presidents when they're speaking. After Lincoln, you hadn't heard of too many, and then nowadays.
Well, and sadly, we have had in the 20th century, we've had assassinations, but yeah, it's hard to know what comes first.
Yeah, exactly.
So on to this third question, which Ed, you've kicked us off on well, the thoughts on beyond the president or our elected officials, going back to what Calvin is imagining as our leader. Where does God provide for our well-being?
I think on where does God provide for our well-being, a lot of that has to do with how we treat each other as people and community. And what I've observed with a lot of this polarization we've experienced is we have different news sources. And depending on where you're getting your information, it pits us against each other. But if you listen, I just went to a lunch with my mom and my uncle. They're on different sides of the political spectrum. But But what he was criticizing was, how could she listen to this media? But she is listening to it. So for her, her perspective is coming from that, and I think if we could just remember to back up, and instead of jumping down each other's throats because of what they've said, remember, where is their heart? Why are they saying it? You know, it's because they've heard something that's affecting them, and actually, if you listened, if you took that same information, you would have that same effect on you and your choices, but that's not the information you're choosing. And I think that's a lot of where we're having these issues now. You know, it used to be we had news sources, everybody listened to the same news sources, and from there you took your sides. Now we've got different news sources, and I think, so bring it back, I would just say, let's try to remember that we're all doing the best we can with the information we've got, and maybe when you take it back down to the heart of people, we're not that different at all.
Yeah, we're all God's people.
Oh, but let me get Ross and Barbara.
Going back to what Penn was saying about judges and kings, I think, I may not be interpreting this right, but I think judges are more connected with God. In a way, have more of the values of God, and kings don't necessarily. If I go back to a strong leader, what I would hope for is a strong leader that has some connections to God, more, you know, somewhat of a sectarian leader, but also a leader that's somewhat of a judge's leader, you know, connecting back with God. So get back to Christian values. You know, does our leader have Christian values or not? So those are the leaps I'm making mentally, thinking about what he's told us and what we're choosing in terms of our leaders.
And I would say you could also pull back, I'm thinking back about his first class where he talked about, doesn't have to necessarily be Christian values. It's a perspective that goes beyond, that goes above, that recognizes all humanity. Those of us in this room, really find our grounding in Christian beliefs and Christian teachings. And I'm not saying that our president should be anything, any particular religion, but one that is grounded in the good for all. So, Barbara, said her come to you next.
I was just gonna follow through on the idea about all the different news cycles that we, focus in, that, going up with Hunter Brinkley and Walter Cronkite, we all hear the same news. I don't think that today we're feeling as much of an emphasis on democracy, as far as we're all in this together. And it's not just me that I need to be thinking about, and this is what I want to tell my students, we're a democracy in this classroom. You're not gonna always get to have your way, so just get used to it. But, we don't always get to have our way. But if we want to be a successful nation, we've got to work together, and we've got to understand that our idea is maybe not always the best all the time.
Janice, and then
I was gonna say, dovetailing on what, or just said, when you think about why do we expect so much? I think it's so much about like a mindset, like a worldview, in the United States particularly, that it's always about winning at all costs, and competition is just a way of life, where it is never a sum zero, and that's okay. It's like there has to be somebody that wins and the other person obviously loses. And when you walk through life with that expectation that there are winners and losers, then that sets up an entire mindset for everything that you look at in your life, down to how you interact with your neighbors. Instead of thinking of what is best for the the good of all. And so I think that goes with into presidential and other elections, that it's all about winning. And so you have candidates, this is from my perspective, that what their verbiage may be is all about how many votes they can get, rather than maybe seeking their souls for what is best overall.
So I'm gonna close with a reading and just to kind of send us out so that we're, they would get to worship. But this comes from a book that Tuesday Bible Study just finished, A Hidden Wholeness by Parker Palmer. And it just struck, I've been thinking about it these 3 weeks. Parker Palmer is a Christian theologian, he's a sociologist, he's a writer, and he is Quaker. And so he says, at Pendle Hill, the Quaker community where I lived and worked for 11 years, our lives were so entwined that people could quickly become attached to each other and just as quickly alienated. But alienated is a mild word to describe my relation to one woman who lived there. She was in my mind the devil's spawn, sent here directly from the pits of hell to destroy all that is green and good about life on earth. And clearly not someone he wants to talk to. The people at Pendle Hill gather every morning in a meeting for worship, 45 minutes of communal silence, occasionally broken by words spoken spontaneously from the heart. One morning, I arrived late for worship, and the only seat available was next to her. Agitated, I came close to turning around and walking out, but I managed somehow to sit down, close my eyes, and start to meditate, slowly forgetting that I was sitting next to a preacher from the dark side. About half an hour later, head still bowed, I opened my eyes and found myself staring at the upturned hand this woman had rested on her knee. There, spotlighted by a shaft of sunlight, I saw a deep but steady throb of heart in her wrist, the elemental beat of her very human heart. In that moment, I knew beyond words that here was a person just like me, with strengths and weaknesses, hopes and disappointments, joys and despairs. In that moment, my sense of who she was and of who I was to her underwent some kind of transformation. I never became close to this woman. In truth, I never stopped feeling wary of her, but I could no longer demonize her as I had in that silent, sunlit moment. This revelation for her humanity and this reframing of our relationship could not have happened, I believe, had I tried to, quote, talk things out, unquote, with her. There is a depth of communion in silence that is sometimes beats what we can achieve with words. So I appreciate that as we go out in, there will be somebody elected on Thursday and presidents all the way down. And about half of, and we may not know on Tuesday, and about half of our country will be unhappy. There will be about half of the people that we meet that will have voted differently than we do. So I just leave you with that as a way to consider that we are all human. So,
Thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you.